episode 1 of The World Needs a Little Talk. I'm Austin Schwartz. I'm currently an undergraduate at Newman University studying English and theater. And I had this idea with my cohort that the world could use a little talk. So I'll let him introduce himself now.
Okay. My name is Mathew Umbarger. I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible. Well, that's my expertise. I'm in the School of Catholic Studies here at Newman University, and I teach whatever they ask me to. And so Austin asked me to teach him in a course of British literature and theology is what we're doing. And so this is the beginning, at least, of The World Needs a Little Talk. So you are getting the result of our academic endeavor here. But I'm really an Old Testament guy. I have a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Ben Gurion University in Israel. So, yeah. But I'm a farm boy from southeast Kansas. That's really who I am.
Thus, overall, he has a lot more insight than I do. So it's a perfect idea to learn.
On this stuff that I'm going to be way out of my depth over the next several weeks. I'm sure I'm going to learn as much from you as you are from me. But it'll be fun. Yeah. Looking forward to it. So what we're doing is you came to me a few months ago with a proposal to have an independent study that would look especially at, I think you were saying dystopian literature.
Yeah, was what we were originally saying.
And I said, well, can we steer this towards apocalyptic? And so now we have... there's still some dystopian stuff, but really, a lot of this is dealing with eschatological questions, the end of the world, and apocalypticism is explicitly treated in several of the books we're going to look at together.
So we'll be looking at that through many different lenses. First, we have stuff that we're not looking at directly from the Bible, but stuff that pulls from that, and that's our starting point. And then we're going to make a major jump, and we're going to look at the graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore, and hopefully we pull some more of a connection to it. I think it's a possibility. That's probably the furthest stretch of material that we have.
So just tell me, I have seen the movie. I've yet to read the comic book. It's coming. So this is all new to me. So why did you put Watchmen in this category?
So I really wanted us to look at a few different mediums of literature, and I thought it'd be really cool if we explored a graphic novel together. Okay. So then there's probably other ones that could be more on par. Like, of course, there's DC, and one of the characters is Darkseid, who lives on Apocalypse, and there's the Darkseid War. That's kind of the end, but equally, both of those mainstream ones have probably multiple iterations you could consider the end, especially the Green Lantern storyline of the Darkest Night, where the Black Lanterns come. But all of that, there's tons of different ones. There's zombie apocalypses in each of those, but I felt that Watchmen is interesting on its own because in this fictional universe that's disconnected from all other superhero ones, all of a sudden there's the birth of Dr. Manhattan, who has the power of God, essentially. He can create, destroy, he can do anything that he wants to. And the whole world just kind of has to hope that he doesn't decide that humans aren't good enough anymore, right?
And we're going to have to talk about this next week.
Yeah, we will.
How much is he like God? But that's
well, and as we read the novel, we'll discover more.
Okay.
But the idea is, more powerful than anything we've ever seen.
He's godlike.
Yeah. Okay. So then, throughout that story, we kind of see that he does start to feel that mankind is not so great. Again, we talked about Alan Moore had a pretty cynical, seems to. We're going to dive into that later. But
so Alan Moore is the author of Watchmen. He didn't draw it.
No, he
He's
didn't draw it.
He's a writer,
Mhm.
not an artist. Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, we'll dive more into Watchmen.
Sure. Next week is Watchmen, but this is but it's still good to think like because so this week we're starting with the Venerable Bede, who is a saint in the Catholic Church, a historian. He lived in the 7th century A.D. As I recall. And you'll have to fact check that later.
I looked it up last night, and I believe he died in 735.
Okay, yeah. So he kind of spans the 7th and 8th centuries. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, quite a ways back, and not a comic book writer, and he's a father of the church. And then we're also looking at one of the York mystery plays from the later Middle Ages, 14th century, I believe, and very, Orthodox Catholic faith expressed in both of these. And then we're taking this wild ride to the 1980s with this graphic novel. And then we're looking at several other things, and we're going to finish the course by looking at another piece of modern Catholic literature written by a British author. So this is going to be a rip-roaring ride.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an apocalyptic sandwich with the Catholic stuff as the bread, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And we'll see
old crusty bread on one end and new Catholic bread on the other.
And then we'll see if there's any sprinkles in those works in between.
Yeah.
I have a feeling there's going to be, even if they're loose, like connections and inspirations for each of these stories.
Well, it's going to be fascinating. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So, well, I believe we're going to start by looking at the play. For those that don't know, it's the guilds at that time would get together, and once a year, it was in June, I believe.
Yeah, so it's for the Feast of Corpus Christi, which I think it would almost always be in June. This would, so after Pentecost, it'd be the Thursday, I think, it's been a long time since I've figured this out. It's a little different in the modern calendar, but it would be a week after the Thursday following Pentecost, so pretty close to Pentecost, and it would always be on a Thursday because Thursday is the day that our Lord instituted the Eucharist, and so it is it's a feast that developed in the late Middle Ages. Actually, St. Thomas Aquinas was commissioned to write hymns for it when it became a feast for the entire church. And it became, the Catholic Church wanted this festival to be celebrated because there were starting to be some doubts about the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And so they made a whole feast day that would celebrate this. And in those days, if a big feast like this was a big community affair. It wasn't just that you did your mass obligation, go home with the kids, go to work. But it would be something you'd take off several days of work, probably, and you would relax and have fun, and you would go and you take in these plays.
Which, well, most would have to take off work because it was the different working groups that put on the plays.
That's right. Yeah, this would have been a very exciting time. I wish I could travel back in time and experience this. I probably don't want to live in the late Middle Ages, to be honest.
Just for that week long.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'd like to visit in let's say 1357, and I need to check, make sure that's not during the Black Plague or something, but that would be okay. If nothing bad's going on that week, that's the week I want to be there. And I think it would have been a really delightful time. I'm thinking about, growing up in southeast Kansas, we had things like that. This is kind of a lost world, but there were little vestiges of it. They weren't religious, but we had the homecoming, the Watermelon Festival. It was always on Labor Day weekend in my hometown of Thayer, Kansas. And it was probably a similar atmosphere. You know, everybody dropped what they were doing, came together, and had lots of fun. And yeah, I think it was the same sort of thing.
That's where his country boy side shows.
Yeah,
I'd call me a city boy. I didn't get to do that. I wasn't here.
Yeah,
but
you had other opportunities.
Yeah. Oh, well, so what we mean by guilds is like the cobblers would get together and do a play, and the woodcutters would get together and do a play.
They're a little bit like unions.
Yeah.
But people who actually own their businesses. So not the employees. But they would support each other in their work. They would exchange trade secrets. It was a, and it was like a community within the community.
Yeah. Well, and then, so that being, you could expect that, like, the woodcutters probably had the best stage. And the stages were all rolling carts that unfolded, by the way. But then the one we're looking at is the Mercers, in which we presume that they had the best costumes because to be a Mercer meant you were a dealer of very fine fabrics and clothing. Yeah,
so this is the last play of the York Mystery Cycle on the Last Judgment. So the language is exquisite, but if you can imagine in your mind's eye as you read this, people dressed in the most ostentatious costumes. So there are a couple devils that show up in here, for instance, and Christ, you know, I'm sure they have him all decked out to the nines. And it would have been a feast for the eyes, no doubt. You know, you read this and you might think that's a little bit corny, perhaps. It's not like modern stagecraft. This is all before Shakespeare. You wouldn't get to Shakespeare without this, I don't think.
Yeah, this definitely set the stones.
Yeah. But Shakespeare improves upon this. I think we can say that. But there's something charming and beautiful about this in and of itself. So, and it's very biblical. This is more or less, this last play, pretty much just retells, paraphrases Matthew 25, the judgment of the sheep and the goats. So there's not a lot of speculation about the end of the world, that sort of thing. We'll get to that with Bede. But anyway.
Yeah. So overall, this is pretty clean cut. They're just putting the message there. No self-interpretation. We agree that they did a very good job of that. Like we said, there's no like added personal perspectives or speculation or anything like that. So.
And probably the people who wrote this are trying to be careful and not do a whole lot of that. They're just wanting to, you know, portray, say, standard Orthodox Catholic teaching for the masses. Yeah. So, did you have a favorite passage that? Because so this is going to be the fun part because Austin and I don't really know Middle English that well, and this is written in Middle English. And we're going to make fools of ourselves now.
Yes, we are.
By trying to read some passages from this. I've got one ready. But
if you have yours ready, go ahead. I have mine. I just gotta locate it.
So it's really, I think, on the whole, the play is really effective because it opens with God coming on. And imagine that. So you've got somebody playing God. That's a
lot of pressure on that.
Yeah, and again, just imagine the costume that he's wearing. But God comes out on the stage, and he gives a little brief survey of salvation history, the creation of the world, the fall of man, and his message is more or less, man, I've done everything possible to save these people, and they just won't be saved. They're like really, really stubborn. And as he's going through, and so now it's time to bring an end to all things. Anyone who's going to get saved is saved, and so we're just going to wrap it all up. And so then it unfolds with the rest of the play. But we have this long, and you know, it's like a page and a half, 2.5 pages a soliloquy, really.
It's a very long monologue
Yeah.
that I wouldn't want to pressure memorizing myself.
Especially in Middle English.
But, Shakespeare's hard enough for me. Those page and a half words.
But this stanza here really jumped out at me, and it's towards the beginning. It's actually the fourth stanza in his soliloquy. Too long and late methought it good to catch those caitiffs out of care. I sent my son with full blithe mood to earth to salve them of their sore. For ruth of them he rest on rude, and bought them with his body bare. For them he shed his heart's blood. What kindness might I do them more? This is my favorite part. And so when he's saying to catch those caitiffs out of care, caitiff is like a wretch, and he's saying I've worked so hard to draw these wretches out of their sufferings. Mm-hmm. Is what he's saying. Like, sin brings death, and so I sent my son with full blithe mood, which would be mood here is like his disposition. He's saying like he sent him. His son comes as a cheerful incarnation of the second person of the Holy Trinity, to salve them of their sore. So he comes to heal them of all of their wounds that come from sin. And my favorite line in all of this is, for ruth of them he rest on rude. So there's a lot of alliteration. You can hear the language of this. This is a carefully composed piece, but this line, we use ruthless all the time, and it's funny, I often say, man, you're ruthless, you have no ruth. I use that as a joke, because my jokes are really lame. But it kind of amused me to see, well, here's like, somebody else is doing that, like, this is before we stopped using that word by itself, ruth. Ruth is just mercy. So for mercy of them, he rested on the rood, the cross. So for mercy on the people, he basically took his place on the cross and died for them, pouring out his heart blood. So for ruth of them, he rests on rude. I really love that line. What's your favorite line?
Well, I was gonna, in yours, I love the final line of that stanza. It really punctuates that whole message that you were just saying, and he ends with, what kindness might I do them more?
Yep.
Like, I feel like that's a very good punctuation for that, ending that stanza. But
and this is kind of a theme in English religious literature, if you think about it. This is calling to mind something from a couple centuries later, but John Milton's Paradise Lost. Where, have you read Paradise Lost?
I've attempted.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It is. But at the beginning, he says very plainly that his whole purpose in writing this epic is to justify God's ways to man. It's a sort of theodicy, like trying to put God in the judgment seat a little bit and acquit him, as we accuse him of not being fair or whatever. This kind of what you see going on here as well, which is interesting. There's a common through. I imagine this is going to come with some of the modern literature we read as well.
But so the passage that I liked a lot was I'm over at page 277.
Okay.
And this is when now this is Jesus now talking, and the good souls and the bad souls are on the stage around him. This is where we're getting to where he is separating the sheep from the goats, and it's not verbatim. I don't think really at all, but it captures it so well that you almost feel like it is. Like it immediately you're like, that's from the book of Matthew. But so
and everyone would have known that text this time,
But so I really enjoyed the language of this part, because again, like, and everyone at that time would have, but it really made me go immediately like, oh, that's the book of Matthew. But so I'm gonna go at the stanza right before the good soul.
Oh, okay.
When I was will and weariest, ye harbored me full heartfully. Full glad then were ye of your guest, and plained my poverty piteously.
Piteously.
These words. Believe ye brought me of the best, and made me my bed full easily. Therefore in heaven shall be your rest, and joy, and bliss to be me by.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Mm.
Yeah. Plained my poverty piteously. Yeah, all this alliteration. That's the other thing. Have you ever had a play where you actually have this kind of alliteration?
Yeah.
Trying to get it out?
A lot of Shakespeare has that alliteration, and then
it's a challenge, right?
It is. Well, and especially this, while the language itself is more complex, as in the Old English, the alliterations are easier to follow.
Yeah.
In Shakespeare's, even as the performer who does it after a few times, it still go over your head.
Really?
Like, you gotta sit there and make sure you understand what you're saying. Especially because there's a lot of stuff that you don't even realize that was like a double entendre. Had an alternate meaning and all of that. Like, the other day, I learned about the word wit. And we always think, oh, he's witty, right? And he used it in that way. But what I learned the other day, and apologies if this is a little, but apparently wit also referred to a penis.
Oh.
So then often he would make jokes.
He has a sharp wit
about people. Exactly. That's the stuff he'd put in there all the time. Or then he'd be like, "This man's wit is lacking," like in referring to someone who did something stupid, but equally it has that double meaning. And I just figured that out the other day. Because I figured that out in a TikTok. Someone pointed that out because then they pointed out that J.K. Rowling studied a lot of Shakespeare, and she would have known that when creating, I think it was Harry Potter fans, I'm sorry. It was either the House Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw, and that house's like code or whatever is something like, may your wit be long and hard, like, pretty on the nose once you learn what that means. And then that dude, put it on TikTok, made a big deal about it, because he was like, she was writing a story of wizards for children, and the dog joke was in there.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of that sort of. Well, I think there are in other parts of the York mystery plays, but in this particular play, it's pretty clean and straightforward.
Yeah.
Not a lot of double entendres. It's pretty.
Well, I think it's especially because of what they're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty sober. The one place where it's a little bit raucous, I think, is with the devils. And I'm sure these guys were hamming it up when they were on the stage, and but even they are, they talk about how they're going to put up a fight, and then they just quail in fear. Yeah, which is pretty effective actually.
Yeah. Well, the other thing we mentioned was that when the bad souls are first introduced, they are immediately like, yeah, I'm a sinner. I was bad. I'm going to be punished. And, yeah. And we talked...
I deserve this.
Yeah.
I had this coming to me. Yeah.
And we talked about that at the time, that would have been very straightforward to the audience of, don't be like me. Don't do what I did. And then plus, it... if you make them try and fight it or argue, then it can create sympathy for.
Here's another thought, Austin. I think if you had done a survey of the audience back then and said, "Do you think you're going to heaven?" I think you would have been shocked to hear how many people said, maybe not. Whereas if you ask the same, on Sunday, if we ask the people at the Little Mermaid.
I'm thinking majority of a crowd of people.
We all think we're going to heaven. Yeah. I think we have a different sort of relationship with these things than they did. And probably a lot of people in the crowd were just kind of resigned to their fate. Like I I don't know that I can repent at this stage in my life.
That cobbler was like, I heckled a man out of his shoes the other day.
I know.
It's
what I do. I don't know. It's a, but yeah, they're definitely. But that's a good insight that we have a very different perspective, even in the Catholic, like Orthodox Catholic Church, as an Orthodox Catholic theologian, pretty traditionalist. And, now we discuss at length, is it a possibility that someone, so for instance, the Catechism is very clear. So you wouldn't have heard this when this is written. The Catechism says very plainly that someone who has not been baptized can achieve salvation. Well, can receive salvation. You can't achieve it, but God can, by His own mysterious means, provide salvation to that soul. And I'm not sure that the people who wrote this play would have believed that.
Yeah.
So we still say that salvation that baptism is necessary for salvation, but we would also say God is not constrained by His sacraments like we are. If we know what we're supposed to do, we have to act in accord with them, whereas God is not bound by that. And I'm not sure they would have been as willing to. I'm sure they wouldn't have been. This is a more modern development in Catholic theology. So even within the Orthodox traditionalist Catholic circles, our attitudes about damnation are different. I think there's a continuity, but we've developed a little bit and we've meditated on it a while. And you can find church fathers, especially from the East, who would say things more close to what we say today. So it's not like no one ever said this, but this is a newer development where it's more widespread.
You know what would have been interesting is when I say audience participation, I mean like when he really gets down to sorting. You go to my left, you go to my right. If people would have moved themselves, if the crowd would have.
Wow.
We'll never know, but that'd be interesting.
That almost sends chills down my spine.
I know, that's...
Ooh, that'd be a very different play. A little dress rehearsal for The Last Judgment. So, wow, that's pretty cool. Well, I think we need... Oh, well, you had a good question. Let's see.
How are we on time?
Okay, we've got... It's 20 till... I think we're good. Okay. So, you asked an interesting question of me when we were talking about this the other day. Do you remember what it was? It's okay. I remember what it was.
I'm sure you... Well, I asked multiple, so I don't know.
Well, the big one here that I think we should address before going on, because it shows up in Bede too, I noticed, is a lot of times they use the word paradise.
Oh, yes.
Which I just kind of take for granted when I see that as being a synonym for the next world, the life to come.
Well, that's what I thought, so that's why I proposed the question. So, example, in this play, they often will use heaven, but they'll also use the term paradise. And what I also caught was paradise was always capitalized.
Okay.
And so that's what, and well, heaven's not, which...
Interesting, yeah.
So then I was like, I always assumed, same thing. So then it made me wonder, could there be an intent behind that? So that's why I brought it up to you, to see what your insight might be.
So more or less, they're synonymous. Paradise is an interesting word, though. So do you know what paradise means? It's okay if you don't. I'm just curious.
I mean, when I think of paradise, well, I guess typically I think of heaven, but like
heaven.
Peace, like no peace, happiness, no more strife, struggle, stress. Like paradise is, I don't want to use the term perfect, but in a sense, like it's the ideal, like it's the perfect place.
But it comes from it's actually a Persian word, pardes, which is was adopted by Jewish people during the Persian exile, It enters in the Hebrew vocabulary, Aramaic vocabulary then, and then eventually enters Greek through them. So the Greek Septuagint, which was translated around 200 years before the birth of our Lord, uses pardesos, which is pardes, to translate the word for garden, gan. So like when you read about the Garden of Eden in Genesis, this is the word that shows up there, is paradise. And that's why Christians begin to use paradise as a synonym for heaven. And it's kind of cool. So Pardes was originally a royal garden. This would be where the emperor would go to take his afternoon siesta or something. So it would be like the best of the best, like going to Botanica if you live here in Wichita. But you have that as your private possession. You don't have
if
to pay
you
money.
owned all of Botanica.
That's right. That would be. I mean, Botanica is actually a good example of, I think, what the Jewish people think of when they talk about a Pardes or the Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and the Jewish people actually even today they never talk about going to heaven. It's always going to Gan Eden, to the Garden of Eden. And I think that's significant. So it's a return to what we lost in the fall, and even like better than that. And there's also something. There's a hint of the resurrection in that. This is about the resurrection. So they're not going off, to float on clouds, and have this ethereal existence forever and ever, which sounds really boring, just sing hymns all the time. But they're gonna actually enter into a sort of Garden of Eden with lots of delights, also work to do, things to do. It'll be fun, and I would assume challenges of some sort as well, but not the kind that crush our soul like they do today.
No, not the ones that we are used to.
Yeah, and that's the what people in this day and age and what they've received from the Jewish people. I mean, this I think is what Jesus is preaching when he talks about coming and welcoming the faithful souls into the rewards of his kingdom. Come into my kingdom, good and faithful servant, right? Enjoy your reward. This isn't just some sort of ethereal spiritual bliss, but there's something corporeal about it as well. So, yeah. So I think it is an important word because it's a little more earthy. Paradise is more earthy than heaven. Technically, when we talk about heaven, I mean, heaven can mean different things in the Bible. It can mean the atmosphere. It can mean the abode of God. But when we talk about that, I mean, since God doesn't have a corporeal body, like it's weird. So where does God live? Well, in that respect, heaven can be right here because God can be right here. And I think when we think in those terms, yes, we will be in heaven after the resurrection, not because we're going to go off to somewhere, out in outer space, but we'll actually have this experience of God's presence that we just have little glimpses of today.
First will be made anew.
Yeah, so we get that in Bede.
Point.
Yeah, let's talk about Bede.
Yeah. So anyone that wants to look at these plays, you can just find them online. And if you're used to reading modern plays, keep in mind it's not structured the exact same. There's little to no stage direction because back then, and then still during Shakespeare's time, it was all interpreted by the performers.
I got both of these on archive.org. You can access them there. So archive.org is really wonderful. Yeah, I'm trying to, this is really, The Reckoning of Time is the name of this book by Bede. And it's so he's a historiographer. He wrote his most famous work, the thing that everyone knows him for, and that if you've read any Bede, this is probably what you've read, is his history of the church in England, up to the point that he's been alive. So he's really interested in history, but he writes this book on reckoning time, how to basically do the job of chronology, but he's really interested in primarily there's a big dispute between the East and the West. It's going on to this day about how you calculate Easter. There's a whole section of this book, and that's probably the part that he was most interested in.
Uh-huh.
But as he's doing this, he kind of lays out this schema of historiography, and he talks about the different ages of the world as he's laying this out, and with the salvation as sort of the heart of it all. Everything builds up to the incarnation and Jesus' work on the cross, and then everything flows out of that. And then he follows that. He says that Jesus' death on the cross begins the sixth age.
Okay.
That
I was
we
going
are
to
now
ask
in.
for clarity on the ages. I tried to look it up to make sure I
Okay.
understood it right, and that's what I thought. I
Yep.
was like, okay, so we're in the sixth age because it began then, but I wanted to make sure because I was like,
You're right.
how are the ages decided? Where are we? Right, but so then I presume that because now a lot of this makes more sense, being the
Good.
seventh age that would be. We'll get into that when we get to
Yeah,
that point.
so, well, the seven epics of history for Bede, and this is not unique to him. The 7 epics of history for him would correspond in some way with the 7 days of creation. 6 days of creation, and then the 7th day of rest. And so a whole gob of things have to happen on that 6th day to get us to the day of rest.
Yeah.
So basically the whole history of the church takes place in this time. And one of the things you see in this, there was a really popular idea. It first shows up in a book that was written perhaps in the 1st century AD, or at least in the very early 2nd century AD. It's attributed to Barnabas, Paul's friend. He shows up in the book of Acts with him. And it's called the Epistle of Barnabas. And there he says, well, I think it's based on that obscure line in 2 Peter, where he says that 1,000 years is as a day to the Lord. And he's like, okay, so we got 6 days of creation. This is a prophecy of the world. So each one of these lasts 1,000 years, exactly. And there are people in his day and age who are speculating. They're trying to set a timetable for Christ's return using this. And as you get closer and closer to the end of the first millennium, people are expecting Jesus to return. And he's already saying, don't do that. That's bad news.
Yeah.
That's stupid. That Jesus told us not to do that. Stop doing that. And I enjoyed this just because of just the sober warnings against making a fool out of yourself. I think it's really helpful. Yeah. What did you think of it?
So, no, I enjoyed this as well. I think it was good that I got to talk to you about it before I read it, so it made it easier for me to flow through and understand. And
it's a little complicated.
A bit, yeah, so overall, this seems like, I feel like I could, buy it. Because honestly, this is the first time I'm exploring any ideas on the second coming and the judgment. I'm familiar with that. I know what it is, but I've never actually got to analyze before. So this was the first time I was getting to do that.
We might talk about some of the different schemas in future discussion, little talks. Yeah, I think that because there's a lot of, it might be helpful to just kind of talk about, there's this idea and there's this one and this one. And And his is pretty close to what the Catholic Church teaches today.
Mm-hmm.
It's got some unique things as well that aren't, let's say, we wouldn't consider it heretical today, but it's not standard teaching for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, it's like right down the center of what you would find in the Catechism, for instance.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, like overall, like sections, like
Mhm.
this whole page here, I summarized it up. I said, don't set dates.
Don't set dates.
Yeah, don't prep.
That's right.
Well, then, so it made me think of the way it was worded. It was kind of like, don't be planning on it. Like, don't plan your life and what you do around it. And it kind of made me, being theater, think of improv. One of the rules is no pre-planning, because the point of improv is to do act and perform on the fly. So then I was like, I wrote down our improv roll up in the corner. I said, no pre-planning.
No pre-planning, that's
Mhm.
right. There's waiting, there is a sort of preparation though.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so waiting with hope and expectancy, but also waiting in such a way that you're not going to be disappointed if you get to the end of your life and he hasn't come back yet.
Yeah. Well, so that was, I actually thought about that and tied it into another improv rule.
Okay, interesting.
Expect the unexpected.
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah, that's exactly this. Yeah, this is gonna happen. But it's not entirely unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's the unexpected is when it will be.
But and he also says there. But I'm thinking of something else.
Uh-huh.
So he says there are like two big signs that have to happen, which probably is a little weird maybe for people who are watching this. So in his section on the time of the Antichrist, by the way, so this is chapter 69 of his book on the reckoning of time. By the way, most of his ideas here are not original to him. He's drawing from a lot of St. Augustine and a lot of St. Jerome. And so we're reading him together because he is an early Christian British author. So he's kind of at the beginning of British literature. He's writing in Latin, not Old English.
So this is translated. We didn't try and read through Latin.
But a lot of this he's just copying and pasting whole, paragraphs.
That's
from
true.
These guys.
Like this whole page, it's all italics.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's also interesting, from, if we're talking about British literature, it shows us that, from the very beginning, British literature has always been influenced by outside ideas. Jerome was originally from Dalmatia, lived in Palestine, in a cave in Bethlehem, did most of his work there. Saint Augustine is from northern Africa, and he's familiar with both of their works and is incorporating them and popularizing them for an English audience. Also, people all over the Christian world are going to read Bede, shortly after his death. He becomes very, very popular, not just in England. So he says two things have to happen before Jesus returns. Again, getting this from Augustine and Jerome. And the first of these is the conversion of the Jewish people to Christ. And this is based on a passage, it's based on a couple passages in the Bible, but the most important one is in Romans chapter 11. So St. Paul says that all of Israel will be saved. Doesn't really explain what that means, but the church has always understood this in an eschatological sense to mean that there will be a mass conversion of the Jewish people to Christianity before the very end. And the other thing that has to happen is the Antichrist has to come. And here he's following St. Paul. This is in 2 Thessalonians. And Paul is writing to people who are really worried that they might have missed the second coming. And he says, no. Y'all know that the man of sin has to come first. And so he's basically saying the same thing. If you're setting dates, and the man of sin hasn't come yet, you're kind of like wasting your time.
Yeah.
Because we all know he has to come first. And yeah, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so it was Enoch and Elijah
Yeah.
will be the ones who come and convert the Jewish people.
Yes.
And then once they've succeeded, the Antichrist will murder them.
That's right.
And then this is where, because we talked about the dates kind of being up in the air, but then here dates start being set. That the Antichrist will rule for 3.5 years.
That's right. Exactly.
And it says exactly. And I thought that was approximate, but no, these verses actually have it to the days.
Yes.
And the weeks.
Yes.
And the months right here, I circled the 42 months, and then next to it I wrote that's 3.5 years.
Yes.
But
so this is based on some obscure passages in Daniel and Revelation as well.
But so then, well, the other thing was we talked about how after the Antichrist is vanquished, and this says it'll either be by Jesus himself or by the Archangel Michael.
Yep.
But we talked about how the period after that is unknown before we're actually. So I'm curious where you pulled that from, actually.
Okay.
Because here it says there will be 45 days after the Antichrist is slain, and then he's going to come back.
All right. So he says.
So unless I'm misunderstanding.
Let's just read this section.
Okay.
Maybe it's not that it's not so much that we don't know when, but there's this weird gap then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's done. The Antichrist is done, and you'd expect Jesus to show up right then.
Yeah.
But there's this period of waiting, like, oh, we're waiting some more.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what he says: when that son of perdition will have been struck down either by the Lord himself or by the Archangel Michael, as some teach, and damned with an eternal verdict, it is not to be believed that the day of judgment will arrive immediately. Okay, so Jesus doesn't come back right away.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, otherwise the men of that age would be able to know the time of the judgment. This is where I was getting it from.
Yeah.
They could set a date. Antichrist is dead. That means Jesus is coming right now.
Starts making tallies on their walls.
Exactly. And you don't do that. Jesus said don't do that. And so if Jesus is going to come back right then, it would like blow the whole logic of what Jesus said there. So this is what I was getting this from. Because otherwise, they'd be able to calculate this. And he says they won't be able to calculate it.
Well,
but later on, I agree, it's a little obscure. If it followed immediately upon the 3.5 years after the beginning of Antichrist persecution, everyone, everyone is allowed to know that the day of judgment will not come before that persecution is completed, but it is granted to no one to know how long after the end of that persecution it will come. That's the part.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't, he's saying you can't calculate it even after the Antichrist is gone.
Well, so then it's the latter half here.
Yeah.
Therefore, the prophet Daniel, who writes that the reign of Antichrist will be for 1,290 days, concludes thus, blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days.
Yeah.
Jerome explains it in this way. He says, blessed is he who after Antichrist is slain, waits until the 45th day after the 1,290 days. That is 3.5 years, when the Lord and Savior shall return in his majesty. But why there should be 45 days of silence after the slaying of Antichrist is known to God alone, unless perhaps we might say that the postponing of the kingdom is a test of the patience of saints.
Yep.
Okay.
So what I think is going on here, I see where you're getting this.
Yeah.
I think he is interpreting, unless he's contradicting himself, but I think for him the 45 days is actually a symbol of like more unknowing.
He's not saying it's exactly 45.
Mm-mm.
He's saying that there's going to be a period.
I think that's okay. What it means.
I can see that because there's actually you're right. All it does say is that there should be 45 days of silence. It doesn't say anything that once those 45 days are
Yeah.
done, that he'll return. It just says, it's kind of saying there will at least be this long of a waiting period, maybe even longer.
I think that's how you're supposed to interpret this.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting to me, really, is not so much all of this calculation stuff. So this is some of the weird stuff that you would not find in, you're never going to hear a Catholic priest preach a homily on Enoch and Elijah.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. I mean, maybe, but probably not. And it's not that Catholics reject that as a possibility, but this, I would say, is more speculative than, and I'd have to go back and read this. I'm not sure even Augustine goes with this. It seems to me if I remember right, even Augustine interprets this as being more allegorical than a literal sense. The reason Enoch and Elijah are supposed to come back is because if you read the Old Testament, they are the only two Old Testament saints who do not die. They're both caught up in heaven, translated into heaven before the end of their mortal life. And so the logic is that since they haven't died yet, that they owe God a death. Because they're sinners just like we are, and the wages of sin is death. So how could they get out of it? Well, they're going to eventually pay the wages of their sin, even though they're righteous and holy, but still, they will pay the wages of their sin when they are martyred by the Antichrist. And this has been a long time teaching. He's not the one to come up with this.
Yeah.
I heard this growing up in my evangelical upbringing, so this is not even unique to Catholicism. But I was surprised to see it here, just to be honest. I was like, oh wow, Bede's doing this way back in the...
Yeah. Well, so what do you personally think of it? You think Enoch and
ask me
Elijah
that.
are going to show up, or?
So, what I think, we got time for this. Yeah, we got 10 minutes or so. If Enoch and Elijah show up, I will rejoice. I think that's, God may well, he can do that. I do believe that Enoch and Elijah are, preserved, body and soul, alive. For Catholics, that's not a big deal. We believe the same thing of Christ. We believe the same thing of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So, why shouldn't they be, Elijah came and visited with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. So, I have no problem believing that Enoch and Elijah are alive, body and soul, somewhere. Planet X, I don't know. but when I read Revelation, it doesn't seem to me, like this section of Revelation in particular, doesn't seem to want to be interpreted in that sort of literalistic fashion. And the two witnesses, when you read Revelation, let's see, it's in chapter...
I was just looking at that page.
It doesn't... I should have looked it up. It's in. It looks like it's in Revelation chapter 11. So in Revelation chapter 11, when the two, it doesn't name them by name, and so some people will even say one of these guys is Moses. I've heard this before. It doesn't name them. It just calls them the two witnesses, and they preach in the holy city. I think that the two witnesses are not meant to be two specific people. I think it represents the church, preaching the gospel and suffering martyrdom from that time. Now, the complication is, I don't think you actually get much on the Antichrist from the book of Revelation. We always think of the Antichrist as a figure from the book of Revelation. No, he's really from 2 Thessalonians chapter 5. He comes from St. Paul. So there is an antichrist spirit operating in the book of Revelation for sure.
Mhm.
You have this beast that comes up from the sea, the Roman Empire, persecuting the church, which does antichristy type stuff. But the problem is that we do believe there will eventually come, this is in the Catechism, there will someday be a man of sin, like a specific individual. And if you look back in history, I think you can see where Satan has tried to bring him onto the world stage a couple times already. I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of candidates for potential antichrists out there. You can probably name a few if you think about it. It's not Joe Biden. but you can probably think of a few. And someday we believe that Satan will succeed. St. Paul in that, it's a really dark, obscure passage, but he says, eventually that which is holding him back. It's really hard to translate. It's a weird phrase in Greek, but there's something holding back the Antichrist, and eventually God will remove it or allow it to be removed. There's lots of speculation about what that is, but eventually he will come and he will take his place, St. Paul says, in the holy place. So the temple, there isn't a temple in Jerusalem right now. What does that mean? There's a lot of questions about this.
Yeah.
But we do believe that there is something that, there will be a literal person before it all ends who will be the final antagonist against the church and her work on the earth. So if that is meant to be understood literally, literalistically even, then it does raise questions. Okay, well, what about these two witnesses?
Yes.
And so if this is literal, then why wouldn't this be? But I still think, I would tend to think that even, in the last days, when the Antichrist comes, the two witnesses will be there among many more than just two people.
Yeah.
And I think already, I've had friends who have, for instance, I had friends in Israel who were refugees from Sudan who suffered for their faith. Horrific things that you can't even imagine. I can barely imagine it, and I heard it from their own lips. And I've seen the scars that they wore, and I saw the emotional scars that they carried. And they would be some of the two witnesses. See what I mean?
It's like we talked, the 45 days is just a period. It's not exactly 45 days.
Exactly.
Two witnesses isn't exactly two people.
I think for Bede, they're two people. It's
Yeah,
Enoch
for
and
Bede
Elijah.
it seems very, well, he outright states Enoch
Yeah.
and Elijah.
Yeah. But I think that's how I read Revelation. In Revelation 11, the two witnesses, this is just the ministry of the church, preaching the gospel until the end, and suffering. So, suffering martyrdom. So whenever the church preaches the gospel, she suffers for it. And, we had a little bit of a long period, actually, during the Middle Ages, where the church had, some relative peace. But in recent years, more people were slain for their faith in Christ. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, probably mostly Protestant. More people were slain for their faith in Christ in the last century than all centuries put together. And they're all those two witnesses, I would say. That's my opinion. But, hey, if God wants to send Enoch and Elijah to us, bring them on.
Yeah.
I do believe, and this is the Catholic Church teaches this in the Catechism as well, that what he says about the conversion of the Jews, this is something we look forward to and anticipate. And the Catechism says very plainly that the Church is not going to experience the consummation of her mission and the return of Christ without the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
God, He is still faithful to them. They're His chosen people, and He loves them dearly. And He's going to give them the fullness of their salvation. And as Catholics, we believe that comes in Christ. It's a little controversial to say things like that, but that is my firm faith. But God will turn their hearts. It's not my job. We trust He will do that in His time. God will do that, or Enoch and Elijah will do it.
I guess that's something we didn't mention probably when introducing ourselves, is since we'll be dealing with a lot of this material, I think it probably was understood that you're of Catholic faith.
Yeah, I'm a Catholic.
And then
I'm at Newman University. I'm in the School of Catholic Studies.
Yeah, so I'm also at Newman University, but I am not Catholic. I would call myself non-denomination. I am a Christian that believes in Jesus and does not know as much as he does about anything.
Of course, Austin, I would always say that the Catholic Church is the first non-denominational church, but there, I'm just being honest.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time, but I actually did have one more question.
Sure.
And this is a simple one, I
Good.
figured. But most of his footnotes refer to, of course, now I can't find one, but the Book of Apocalypse.
Oh yeah,
And I was going to ask, what is that? Because
it's probably what you know as the Book of Revelation.
okay, and he's just calling it.
So whoever edited this, they know the Book of Revelation as the Apocalypse of Saint John.
Okay.
So
That makes sense.
Apocalypsis is its name in Greek. Revelatio is its name in Latin. It's the same book.
Okay, cool. I suspected that at one point, but then I think it's because I was tired. I went on this huge tangent rabbit hole of what are all the lost books? What are the books referred to that we cannot find? What do we not know? And I realized that I went on this deep hole that completely sidetracked from this reading.
This would be a much more interesting book if it had some of those lost books in it. But
yeah.
He doesn't. He quotes church fathers, but he doesn't quote any lost books. At least not here.
Yeah.
He refers to the Epistle of Barnabas. That's the closest you get to something like that.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
You're right. It would have been really cool if you had some footnotes to a lost book. Actually, there's one point that it says that the manuscripts for this cannot be found.
Okay.
Let me see if I can
I'm trying to
find
remember
it.
where that is.
I think it might have been toward the end, but there was only one footnote that said that, and I thought that was very interesting.
So, Bede had a lot of opinions about this. He wrote a whole book on the Book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just a little section out of one little book where he talks about this.
Oh, here we go. On page 244, that's his footnote 22. The source of this etymology is unknown. It is not one of those offered. And
By
then
Isidore. Okay, so what are we looking at? So he's talking about the burning of the heavens at the end of time. He's saying that it can't be talking about the firmament of heaven in which the fixed stars revolve. So Bede obviously is using a Ptolemaic cosmology. That was the standard cosmology of the day. Nor the ethereal heaven, that is that great empty space between the starry heaven and our troubled atmosphere, full of pure and tranquil diurnal light, in which it is believed that the 7 wandering stars roam. So this would be planetary heaven. But this heaven of air, our atmosphere, aerium, the one close to the earth from which the birds, aves, of heaven, that fly therein take their name. Okay. So, yeah, how do you get aves from aerium? And they're saying, we don't really know.
yeah, they're saying we don't know. He didn't.
So this might be a little place where you see Bede. He knows Latin quite well, but it wouldn't have been his first tongue.
Yeah.
Old English would have been. And so you might see him maybe getting out of his depth here and making a conjecture that probably isn't true. So He's a church father. We revere him, but he doesn't know everything. So
none of us can.
Yeah. I'm just gonna say, Saint Bede, pray for us. You don't have to pray, but yeah, I've enjoyed talking about him, and yeah, he's a good soul. So this was fun.
This was fun.
First of our little talks. What's the title again?
The world needs
a little talk. All right. Thanks, Austin.
Yeah. Thank you. This is a great start to what I hope to be a fun adventure.
I hope it was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next week, Watchmen.
Yeah, that'll be split into 2 parts.
Yeah.
So next will be Watchmen Part 1, and then followed Watchmen Part 2.
First 200 pages.
Yeah, we're splitting it down the middle. It's just a long novel. That's all.